Hello, distinguished guests, and thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Desert Tiger Podcast. As we ride into year 3 of the DTP. And of course, I am your host here on the show, here on the Desert Tiger Podcast. My name is Colton G, and today on the show, we're joined as Robert Carli, as we talk about the awesome music project and their songs of hope and happiness. What exactly is that? Well, I'm going to be giving you a brief description coming up very, very soon. But before we go ahead and get there, there's a few things I want to go ahead and say first. So if you, like myself, are Canadian, the federal election is coming up soon, so you should probably get your ass out and vote. If you're like me, maybe you went out and hit the advance polls, but either way, if you want a say in the future of Canada, once again, if you're a Canadian, get out there on October 21st, 2019 and do your thing. If you're one of our listeners who is not a Canadian, you can completely disregard that, but you should probably know that today's episode was brought to you today by ilovedtp.com. Why is that? Because over at ilovedtp.com, that's right, you beautiful soul, you are going to go ahead and find yourself the latest and greatest in Desert Tiger Podcast swag so that you can rep the show every single place you go, in front of your friends, in front of your family, and heck, even in front of your enemies. Alright, fam. Music has incredible powers. Regardless of your taste, more than likely, you have a collection of songs, bands, or genres that you have a deeper meaning or connection with. Whether they remind you of a moment in your past, or help drive you through a challenge that's ahead of you in your future. Everyone seems to have an incredibly unique experience in their journey with music. This seems to transcend background, upbringing, culture, and status. And it even seems to connect those divided by those things. This incredible power is what drove Terry Stewart and Robert Carli to create the awesome music project's Songs of Hope and Happiness. What started with Terry's passion to know more about how music affects the people around him, the idea quickly morphed, and after showing his neighbor and local musician, Robert Carli, a few of these powerful stories, the duo began collecting, collaborating, and researching to gather and put these tales to print. 111 different Canadians of various lifestyles and backgrounds create a beautiful and incredible medley, sharing the life-changing powers of music and what it has done for them. Some of the Canadians whose stories are included inside of the awesome music project's Songs of Hope and Happiness happen to include the likes of Sarah McLachlan, Rick Mercer, Theo Fleury, and astronaut Chris Hadfield. Not only does this book contain 111 incredibly moving stories about different people's experiences with music, it is also combined with statistics and facts about music's amazing powers on human beings and its ability to assist in the healing of our mental health. But it doesn't just end there, as AMP is also dedicated to continuing to drive the research on the connections between music and mental health, with proceeds from the novel sales going towards research in this area. Today, Robert Carli joins me on the Desert Tiger Podcast to discuss the awesome music project's Songs of Hope and Happiness, how he ended up becoming involved with the project, what it means to him, and just the incredible things that AMP is continuing to do with music and mental health. I am extremely excited to jump into today's episode of the podcast, so why don't we just go ahead and do that? So get ready to rumble through the jungle with the Desert Tiger Podcast and Robert Carli as we discuss the awesome music project and their book of Songs of Hope and Happiness.
The Desert Tiger Podcast.
All right, today on the Desert Tiger Podcast, I am joined by Robert Carli, and today we're going to be speaking about AMP. AMP, of course, is the awesome music project, and they have just released a book entitled The Awesome Music Project, Songs of Hope and Happiness, and we're going to be speaking about that book today with Robert Carli. Thank you so much for joining the DTP today, Robert.
Thanks, Colton, for having me on.
Oh, I'm extremely excited to have you on the show today. This is a very deeply emotional, very moving, and a very, very insightful read. So I'm very excited to dive into it today.
Yeah, it can take you on to a lot of places because it's, as you know, it's a collection of stories. So it's really 111 stories. So, you can experience 111 songs or stories about songs or, different voices and different emotional places, really. It's quite rich that way.
It's incredibly rich. Definitely. It's moved me to tears a couple of times. But before we get into exactly the contents of the book, I want to know how you were brought into the project. You get into it a little bit into the introduction of the book, but tell the listeners of the Desert Tiger Podcast how you became involved with AMP.
So Terry Stewart is a neighbor of mine, and it was his brainchild, really. He was obsessed with trying to catalog music that made people happy. He basically would go around to people saying, "Hey, what's your happy song?" And he would ask this question to almost anyone he would meet. And his motivation for doing that, well, there was a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons was he was trying to figure out how music can make people feel better. And he was specifically motivated by his own personal experiences and some friends and family who had undergone some episodes and periods of depression and anxiety. And he knew that music had a sort of naturally therapeutic quality about it, as I guess we all intrinsically do. We know that music can change the way we feel. But he was trying to quantify that and looking more at the science of it. And he thought by compiling a list of songs that made people happy, maybe he could somehow create a formula that could then be applied to many other people. And I told him right away, I said, "Terry, that's a ridiculous idea." And, my reasons, and I think most people would sort of understand this, is that music is highly subjective and that there's, your happy song and my happy song are going to be two different things. But he collected a few stories, and he showed me the stories, and then I realized that it wasn't so much about the song itself. It was more about the narrative and the story behind the song, because it really connects us as people when we understand or try to understand what it is that music means to other people and why a certain song resonates in a certain way or why it was important to them at a certain episode in their life. And so, I sort of got into this idea with him, and I started to collect some stories, and we accumulated a whole pile of them. And his like I say, his motivation was highly personal, but then he also was trying to figure out the science behind it, and that drove him to go down to the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, which is here in Toronto, and it's one of the leading researchers in the world on this sort of research. And so he teamed up with a group of 3 or 4 doctors, and they in fact had a program that they were looking for funding for. It was a program that it was really a proposal to look at more of the empirical data surrounding the science behind music therapy and how it impacts the brain, specifically the brain chemistry, and trying to come up with more data that could then validate music therapy as, I guess, as a, we all know it works, but I guess we're trying to legitimize it more and to understand why it possibly isn't being prescribed more in the medical system in Canada. There are other places where I think, like in the UK, for example, where they're a little further ahead of us on this kind of research, and just in terms of their policy from a government point of view, what is prescribed when one is suffering from anxiety and depression. In those countries, or in the United States, where the National Institute of Health has just released a report to fund $20 million worth of studies in this same field. And we were finding here in Canada there's not much going on, and there's a program here waiting to be funded. So let's put these stories together, and let's raise some money for CAMH. And in the process, we'll also, remind people of the therapeutic nature of music.
Wow. So what turned from a list of songs originally morphed into a stories of across a nation, and you actually ended up teaming with Canadian Mental Health Association to find out more about music. That's incredible.
Yeah, it really just started as a, chatting over the fence, so to speak, with your neighbor, and it turned into a book idea. And then from then, it really evolved into more than a book. It evolved into a campaign to raise funds and awareness for music and mental health research.
Wow. So what exactly is your background in music that your neighbor was willing to approach you and ask you if you wanted to be involved with this project?
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm a professional musician, and he looked to me as some sort of authority, which is why when I first shut him down on the concept, I think he was a little bit disappointed. My full-time job is really just, I'm a musician. Most of my time I spend writing music and producing music for TV shows and films. I've been doing that for about 25 years. I'm also a performer, and I play with different groups and ensembles. And I teach a bit, but I spend most of my day creating or writing or performing music. And so he looked to me as like I say, like an authority on the role of music from a therapeutic point of view. And I was like, well, don't think I know too much about that, but I wanted to find out more. And also, like I said, I was curious about the idea of trying to collect these stories. And so then, I should say that a lot of the story contributors are musicians, but not the majority by any stretch. I think it's maybe 25 or 30% are people who make music professionally, or who are professional musicians, or are capable musicians, I suppose. Whereas the rest are not. We have people who are from all different walks of life, and I thought that was very important. Just because sometimes when musicians speak about the role of music, there can be sort of a perceived bias that maybe, well, for them, music's different because they use it differently than the average person. And while I can assure people that's not the case, and that music really affects everyone, not the same, but everyone, the sort of magical, if you will, or transformative power of music applies to all people, regardless if you're a musician or not, the way when you hear a song. So I'm trying to dispel that myth, but regardless, in the book, there's about 25 or 30% musicians, and the rest aren't.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you had already had experience from working with music and film and TV, with how mood can affect a scene and how someone interprets it, and he just wanted to delve further into that realm.
Yeah, I think so. I think he made an interesting connection there that I don't think that even occurred to him, or even occurred to me, is that, yes, indeed, when you're scoring for picture, for TV or film, there is a kind of an idea that you're using the music to heighten the emotional core of a film. And, one could argue possibly you're using music to manipulate, or using music to do something beyond just listen to it. It's functioning in a different way. And so, I'm inherently tuned into, therefore, the power of the music to do something beyond just have an aesthetic quality. That's an interesting observation. I don't think I made that connection right away, and I don't think even Terry did. He just came to me because I knew a lot about music, I suppose. But yeah, there's a funny kind of connection that, yes, indeed, in my profession, I'm possibly just maybe more aware of the role of music in how emotionally it impacts people.
It's interesting how over a fence conversation can just end up having that extra level of connection.
Yeah, you never know what's going to happen. So next time you talk to your neighbor over your fence, just be careful. It might lead to something.
It definitely might. And something that you mentioned that I am actually really inspired by in this book is that it isn't just a large portion of musicians. And one of the first stories that the book starts off with is a very well-known musician in Sarah McLachlan. But you also have a lot of different people of different backgrounds, different career paths, of different experiences, I'm totally dropping the word there. Ethnicity.
I know where you're going with that. Yeah, exactly.
So you're definitely not only getting a map of just across Canada, you're also getting an experience of different people who come from different worlds.
Yeah, we were trying to be as diverse as possible with the book. This is a big country. And so, yeah, you're right. We tried to represent geography with every province and territory represented in the book. We tried to represent demographic in terms of age. Like, I think the youngest contributor is 8, and the oldest just turned 100, which is pretty awesome. And then, you mentioned ethnicity, background in terms of work background, status in terms of, like, some people are very famous in the book and some people are not very famous at all. Gender. We try to really represent the diversity of the nation. We have Indigenous people in the book. We have LGBTQ in the book. So everyone is kind of represented. Well, not everyone, but we're hoping that we try our best, and we hope that, you can look at someone in the book or find a story where you can maybe relate to it a little bit.
Mm-hmm. And even if it's something that maybe you didn't experience just through their connection to music and their story to the music, you can end up seeing that song through an entirely different light, and that ends up helping you understand that person so much better.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, if you told me your song from your story was something that really turned me off, like something, I don't know, Wind Beneath My Wings, I may not like that song. Or maybe I used to, but I don't anymore, let's pretend. And I heard that song, or you told me that, and I'd be like, oh, not interested in your story. But then I read your story, and then I understand why the song is so important to you, and it's obviously got something really important to you. It changes the whole conversation. It changes the lens at which I look through that song, and when I hear that song, it really changes the way I perceive it, and I perceive, what your journey was. And so, to put into that concept into practice, what we did was we did a couple of events, actually. And, I wasn't sure if it would work or not. So on Thursday, as you mentioned, our book just came out. Thursday was World Mental Health Day, the last Thursday, October 10th. And we did a few events, and we like I say, we put the concept to the test, where we have storytellers read their stories, and then singer-songwriters sing those songs, and then neuroscientists come out and discuss what's happening. So kind of an evening of stories, songs, and science. And you'd be amazed when you hear the story behind a song, and then you hear that song played possibly in a different way than the original recording, because it's impossible to do that. The impact that had on the room, I suspected it would have, it has an emotional impact when you hear it, when you read it in stories. As you mentioned, you were crying a bit when you read the book. But when you hear it live, it's almost another whole other dimension. And that really, I think, was what we experienced in our live event, where people were just, people were moved to tears. And, it was a very heartwarming experience, listening to some of the stories and then hearing performers play those songs, and then having a neuroscientist come out to talk a little bit about what's happening.
That's really an incredible event, especially from a live music standpoint, and something that I don't know if it's ever really been done before.
Well, it's certainly, obviously concerts have been done, and stories in concerts. When you do it with the science piece, and you do it for the motivation of raising money for mental health research and awareness, I think that's possibly something a little different, and that's why we're really doing it. And, our event on Thursday featured some beautiful stories. We had a story from a guy named Shakur Ghati. He was a Canadian Armed Forces lieutenant in Haiti in 2010 during the earthquake. He was buried alive, and he had used music almost to keep him alive in the song Lovers in a Dangerous Time by Bruce Cockburn, but specifically he cited the Naked Ladies version of that song, which is well known, and he used that song in particularly the line, kicking at the darkness till it bleeds daylight. Like, he literally was doing that to try to escape, being entombed in rubble after the earthquake. And then Ed Robertson and Jim Cregan from the Bare Naked Ladies came out, took the stage, and sang Lovers in a Dangerous Time, and it was such an uplifting experience. And we did that 3 or 4 times in a row with different singer-songwriters and storytellers, and it just is like a really emotionally charged kind of event, and it works, I think.
And it's really incredible that the musicians are getting behind that too, and willing to involve themselves in that aspect of mental health as well. And it also maybe helps show them, because for them, like, they originally did this song as a cover, and they have their own reasons for why it's important to themselves, but now it means an entirely different reason because they have seen what it means from someone else expressing that emotion live, and then probably seeing the joy on that person's face after they performed the song.
Yeah, I do think there was. It's an interesting perspective for the creators or the musicians as well to hear what their song means to somebody else. In fact, Ed was the singer, and he mentioned that. And in fact, on the back of the book, if you have it in front of you, I don't have one right in front of me, but the back of the book, there's a nice quote from Ed. Do you have a book handy there, Colton?
I do have an electric copy available.
Oh, okay. So on the very back cover, I'll go find one. Maybe I can remember what he says. He says, Ed Robertson from the Bare Lady says, I have spent my entire life dedicated to recording and creating music, and it still fascinates me what it means to people. I think that's what he said as a sort of quote, and then he said, this is a great read, or something like that. Like, he was endorsing the book, but in doing so, he was mentioning that he even though he's been doing it all his life, he's still fascinated by what music means to people. And I think that's, the essence of the book is that, we all know music. We all know music changes the way we feel. But hearing stories about it from other people, and particularly stories about loss and recovery and stories that have had a sort of pivotal impact on someone's life, like a decision to go away or travel, life-altering events that have somehow a story about a song involved. Those are really interesting stories to read. So,
It's really is incredible. So, I'm curious as to, you said that once you were shown some of the stories that you began to realize just what was possible with this collection of tales. So how far along was this collection once you joined, and where was the project at? Did you guys know that you wanted to make it into a book at that point? What was the goal?
Well, Terry, I think the goal was immediately a book for him. But a book about stories, it was, what is the shape and the form of that? We didn't know. Could it be like 10 stories and then a lot of research and science? We didn't know how it was going to spin out. And I only read a couple of his stories. Actually, I haven't even read. One was just his own story. And then he had mentioned a couple of stories talking to cab drivers and how the surprising stories they were having. It was just, I found it curious, what people would choose. And then I suddenly was like, wow, these are unexpected stories and unexpected songs from people from all over the place. So I think we can dig a bit deeper and find out some more. That's how it all started. And yeah, I mean, at the very beginning, it's like any kind of creative thing, I suppose. You don't really know what the shape it's going to be. It changes so rapidly. I won't say rapidly, but it undergoes significant change throughout the process that it's often a distorted version of itself once it's done,
Definitely. It's funny how things can evolve from what we once thought they could be and how big they actually can end up becoming, especially with working with the Canadian Mental Health Association and having like events like the one you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and in the case of the book, I mean, when you say I'm making a book about stories about music, it's very hard to visualize that. And we have to credit Page 2, our publisher, and their amazing team, including their editor, writer, Scott Steedman, who compiled most of the stories. He helped capture them from our contributors. And also we had Peter Cocking, who, at first was trying to figure out how do you make this book visually interesting. And if someone has a song about The Clash or a story about The Clash, you think, let's just use like the cover of London Calling. Which you can't do. So he would instead make album covers inspired by Blue Note record covers. And we thought that was a very fitting kind of direction because the idea of nostalgia and the idea of stories and how music is like a time machine fits into that nostalgic kind of aesthetic. And we thought, using the old-fashioned Blue Note record cover as a kind of inspiration was a great point of departure, and he went off and, as you can see in the book, made 111 album covers to pair with each story. So that was quite a really a huge undertaking, and hats off to him for doing such a stellar job.
And some of it is extremely powerful connection as well, because it sort of gives you a little bit of a visual look into things, and it helps bring a little bit more vividness to the read as well.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Yeah, it's fun to read the book because it's not, like I said earlier, it's kind of episodic. You don't sit down and read 111 stories. You read one or two, and they may be short, or they might be very involved stories. Some of them are very heavy, as you indicated earlier, and some of them aren't. And so you read one or two, and then you go on to your day, and maybe later on, at the end of the evening, you might just read a couple more. It's that kind of book where it's a coffee table book in essence, and you don't need to sit down and read it all at once.
And it's also broken up episodically in 4 different sections, where it's broken down into music and voice, music and recovery, music and experience, and music and community, which it also helps just show just the different ways that it stretches out as well.
Yeah, the our publisher actually was their idea. That's like I said, page 2. They are headed up by Jesse and Trina White and Jesse Finkelstein in Vancouver. They oversaw the sort of the editorial part of the book, and and with Scott dividing it up into chapters like that, I think was a good idea, because each chapter, we had a number of science articles we wanted to include. We had a number of fact bubbles, and so those are all organized through the chapters, where at the end of each chapter you have a little bit of science. And the stories are kind of grouped in a way which they're sort of related. So if you're reading like the loss chapter, which I think is chapter 2, there's a lot of heavier stories in that chapter, and then you read other chapters, and it's not, the groupings are slightly different.
Definitely. Like the first one is definitely a lot of music and voice, where lyrics help you find your inner spirit and your inner want to show who you are to the world, and how songs have helped empowered people. And like you said, chapter 2 is how it's helped people recover from loss or difficult experiences and just really down times, and from there just how music has brought people together and everything else, and it's just really beautiful.
Oh, thanks.
It really, really is beautiful, just like I'm sure that all of you, the listeners of the Desert Tiger podcast, have your own incredibly beautiful, moving stories about those songs that are incredibly important to you, and I would love to hear those. I would love if you reached out and tagged us in a social media post where you spoke about your own story, or even if you just wanted to go ahead and send us a message, like a DM on Instagram or on Facebook or Twitter, whatever it is. You can even go ahead and email us at desert.tiger.podcast@gmail.com, and I want to hear your guys' story. I want to know more about the listeners of the Desert Tiger podcast, and I feel like this is a great way to do so. So like I said, hit us up on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook at Desert Tiger Entertainment or Desert Tiger Podcast, or like I said, you can also email us your stories at desert.tiger.podcast@gmail.com. And I am incredibly excited to hear more about your stories and more about you. I also want to go ahead and take a quick moment to remind you that today's episode of the DTP is brought to you by ilovedtp.com. Why is that? That's because over at ilovedtp.com, not only is it the place where you're going to go ahead and get yourself the latest and greatest in Desert Tiger podcast swag, so that you can rep the show every single place you go, in front of your friends, in front of your family, and even in front of your enemies with a nice big old loud DTP roar. It's also the best way that you can support the show, because all the proceeds from that go to continuing to help grow the show, whether that is with assisting us in improving our equipment, getting out to do more interviews, or just whatever it happens to be that this goes towards. In fact, with this week's sales of t-shirts over on at ilovedtp.com, there's going to be a nice little donation made on over to the awesome music project so that you guys can feel that little extra bit of good when you're repping the show. And of course, if you want to go ahead and make bigger donations to the awesome music projects, Robert Carli is going to go ahead and tell you how to do that later on in today's episode. But of course, we need to get there, so why don't we go ahead and jump right back in to today's episode of the DTP featuring my guest, Robert Carli.
The Desert Tiger Podcast.
So one thing that I also really incredibly enjoy with this book is how you bring it in with the mental health aspect and the stats that you have listed throughout the book as well, and that just continues to show the connection to the Canadian Mental Health Association. So did a lot of those stats come from the Canadian Mental Health Association, and exactly what did they bring to the campaign?
Well, there's different. The stats are compiled from different sources. So we worked with a number of music therapists and a number of neuroscientists. We pulled different people to contribute to the book. So Laurel Trainer is one of the contributors, and she runs the. She's a what is she? I guess she's a neuroscientist, but she runs the Live Lab down at McMaster. She's also a flautist, but she contributed her own essay on music therapy and what they're doing down in Hamilton. And then we had one, Michael Tout, and Corrine Tout contributed a longer article about the neuroscience side of music therapy. Just a number of different articles like that. We have a guy named Gabe Nespoli who talks a bit about movement and why you want to move or tap your toe when you hear music. So these are just kind of, they're like general interest. They're written in a very familiar style, but they're really talking about the science more than we're talking about personal experience or music. They're not talking, those are not personal stories. They're all sort of, I want to say they're research articles, but they're not done in an overly academic kind of way. They're done in a very familiar style. And the very last of I should mention the very last science piece in the book is a contribution from Jeff Meyer. And Jeff Meyer is the lead scientist at the CAMH, which is the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. He's the lead scientist at the research project that we're funding.
Oh, wow.
So he goes into that a little bit in detail about the proteins and how there's certain proteins in your brain, in your blood, in your body that are heightened, and they've noticed that they're heightened in victims or those suffering from anxiety and depression. And so they wanted to try to measure those and see what 1, 2, or 3 months of protocol-based music therapy exposure had, what kind of impact that would have on those levels. So that would be one way of measuring, from a chemical point of view, the changes in the brain chemistry after exposure to music therapy. Another way is through synaptic density. So they're looking at how your brain changes over time. And, this is a study that doesn't take a few weeks. It takes a long, long time to do. In fact, they're just now in the process of getting their funding now that we're starting to fund it, and now looking for the right candidates. And they need like 40 or 50 different candidates culled from a large pool of people that are, eligible. So it's a bit of a lengthy process, but I think we're really excited about being involved with it, and we'll see what happens.
Wow, so just continuing to push forward and even driving more research from this and moving forward.
Well, yeah, I mean, to us, the research is the most important part of it all, because that's why we're doing this, is to try to actually raise money for research to make a change. So to do that, you need to have the science. And so that's, it's, when you give to a campaign, it's always really important to understand where your money's going. So we want to make sure that everyone understands that this isn't just, we're not just going into doing a PR campaign about music and mental health. We are actually trying to fund a very specific program, which we haven't come up with a good name yet. I keep putting pressure on Jeff Meyer to come up with a clever name for the project. But right now it doesn't have a catchy title, but it's a project that he's spearheading with 4 other doctors that looks at the connections between music and mental health and music therapy and on the chemistry of the brain.
Wow.
He'll come up with an essay title, which will be probably 25 words long, and then we'll have to get it down from that.
Come up with some sort of acronym or something from there.
Mm-hmm. Maybe that's it.
That's fantastic. So we've gone through a lot of the stories inside of the book and how you became involved with the book and what it has allowed you to do afterwards, but I want to dive a little bit into your personal connection with music because I read your part of the introduction. I'm not sure if you actually dive into your experiences otherwise inside of this book. So do you have a song that you connect with or a genre or something else that you really have a powerful story with? Or through your experiences with this journey, looking back, do you see a song that maybe you don't realize had that effect on you now?
Well, I think the answer to your question is more the first part. We all have a music story, and I have a music story. I have many music stories, actually, and I have lots of memories of different music. And in fact, I had articulated one into a story, which we then cut. We cut out our stories. Terry and I both had stories contributed, but we had so many stories, and we wanted to bring them in the book, and so we needed to, for space considerations, we had to cut a few, and we cut ours, and maybe we'll make them into the second book. But my story had to deal with discovering someone through their record collection, discovering who they are. So in this case, I was talking about my wife, who is a violinist in the Toronto Symphony. When I first met her, I was trained as a classical musician, as was she, but I had a totally different, not totally different, but rather different record collection, and I didn't know as much chamber music as she knew. Being a violinist, she played tons of chamber music, and so, off she would go to work, and I would sort of rifle through her CD collection, looking at all this new music, which wasn't new necessarily, but new to me, and discovering a lot of piano trios and string quartets and things that I wasn't really that familiar with, and so music to me became a way when you're falling in love with someone, you fall in love with their record collection, and that was my story. And so I had a specific piece of music, a Schubert trio that I still to this day is really moving. Anyway, that was the nature of my story. But I have so many stories like that, and recollections. And I think one of the things, to answer your second part of your question, like maybe through the journey on the book, I think so many people in this book have talked about an earlier time in their life, oftentimes their teenage years or their adolescence, and discovering some kind of band or song or even genre of music which became helped them to shape their identity. And I remember, and many people talked about the idea of looking through albums, looking through lyrics, and I remember doing that myself. And it never really occurred to me how indelible that image is. I mean, the idea of sitting on the living room floor of my parents' house listening to something like Queen, The Game, and listening to, or reading rather, the lyrics as the song is going by. That was kind of my first experience ever doing that, really putting together the connection that songs that you hear on the radio or songs you just hear anywhere have lyrics, of course, and when you write them out, they look like poems. And, it's almost like you could say that poems are really just, they're really songs waiting to be set to music. And that's kind of what I started to believe and started to think in those terms, because I hadn't really read much poetry, when I was a 15-year-old kid, but I had listened to a lot of music, and I had then started to read the lyrics in a different way. And I have really fond memories, memories that I'll never lose, actually, of just listening to music and reading the music. So that's one of the things I kind of was reminded on this journey.
Wow. Well, that's awesome that allowed you to look back and remember those moments with such fondness.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's kind of one of the beauties of the book, I think, is that it does make every person sort of reflect on their own music story and reflect on what songs make them or make part of their soundtrack. everyone's kind of got a soundtrack in their life, and finding those things out it's a great part of the process.
I definitely agree. You actually hinted that you might add your stories to a second book. Is a second book something that you guys have already started working on?
I haven't started just yet. We're still getting the first one out the door, and we have a few events coming up. But, we've already thought about the idea. I mean, as we collected more stories and we got more and more people enthusiastic about the idea, there are all kinds of stories out there, and we could do collections that are thematically unified. So, for example, you could do a sports edition only, or you could do a youth edition. That's another idea. And I think we could the actors edition. I mean, these are all, or the corporate titans edition. These are all possibilities. So it's just a matter of time and ensuring that we raise the right amount of money on the first book will sort of lead us to more down the road.
All right, fantastic. Well, if any of the listeners of the podcast wanted to continue to assist with the raising of the money, how can they go forward with doing so, or how could they find the book for themselves?
Great question. So you should go to theawesomemusicproject.com, and the first thing you should do is you should follow us along on Twitter or Instagram or LinkedIn or Facebook. So you following us on social media is a great help to us because it helps to build a community, which is one of the goals of this campaign. The second thing you can do is once you're on the website, you can either go to buy, which is where you can buy T-shirts and hats and merchandise and also the book itself, or you have links there to go to. It might be more convenient, depending on where you live, to visit your local bookstore or to just go to Amazon or Indigo and order the books online. That's a great way to do it as well. If you want to give to the campaign, which is really appreciated, you can go to the donate button. And once you're at the donate button, you'll have you'll have a number of choices. You can donate directly to our campaign, or you can donate to one of our partners. So we partner with different charities in different communities. And in addition to CAMH, which is our sort of lead benefactor. So to keep it simple, possibly you just donate to them. That's the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, and that's the project that we're funding about the research. We are currently doing a project right now with Grand River Hospital in Waterloo region and helping to fund their music therapy program. So depending on when you go to the page and when the podcast is on, there's going to be different choices as to who you want to drive your money toward.
Fantastic.
So I should recap. Just go to theawesomemusicproject.com and you can navigate from there to, well, first of all, to social media, but also you can navigate to either the buy page to buy books or hats and merchandise, or you can go to the donate page where you can drive your money to one of our benefactors.
Fantastic. And I feel that this is a very important lesson or important cause, and I'm sure that a lot of the listeners of the podcast will as well.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you for that, Colton. I think it's something that's changed, in the last few years. I think it's more part of the conversation. One could even argue that mental illness and mental health, indeed, it's part of the conversation, but it's also something that's, I don't know what it is, if it's with technology or the nature of our lives or the social media, for whatever reason, I think more people are suffering. If you look at incidents, if you look at the statistics, levels are rising. It's more of a concern to me and to, I think, many people now than it was decades ago, and I think we have to address it. So that's why we're doing this.
I definitely feel that we have to address it as well, and we need to use those tools like technology to destroy the stigma and allow communication to flow freely.
Absolutely, yeah.
All right, I completely agree, and I am so very thankful that you took the time to join me today, Robert.
Thanks, Colton, for having me on the show.
I am absolutely ecstatic that you could take the time to join me. It was an absolute pleasure.
All right, talk to you soon.
And with that, we come near the end of another incredible, exciting, enthralling episode of the Desert Tiger Podcast. But have no fear, because we are going to be back next week, as we always are, and I'm going to be giving you a little bit of an idea of who may be popping up next week on the Desert Tiger Podcast very soon. But before we do that, I want to go ahead and give one last big old DTP thank you to Robert Carli of the Awesome Music Project for joining me here on the show. And like you've heard me say numerous times through this episode, this book is an incredible read, and I am not lying when I said I was moved to tears numerous times while reading the stories that are contained inside of this book. It is an incredible read, and I highly suggest you head on over to awesomemusicproject.com in order to find out more about this wonderful book and the incredible things that AMP is continuing to do with the connections between music and mental health. I also want to go ahead and take a moment to thank Eric Alper for going and setting up this episode. You guys know the man EA helps us out a whole lot, and we got mad love, mad respect for Eric. So thank you so much, EA. You know what it is. And of course, it wouldn't be Desert Tiger without you guys, the listeners of the show, for tuning in to these episodes, for sharing them on your social media, for subscribing to the show if you're a new listener, hint hint, and for leaving those 5-star reviews over on iTunes and Apple Podcasts and Stitcher, because those help our shows chart. It helps us reach a new audience. It helps us bring in bigger and better guests. And baby, that's all we want to do over here at Desert Tiger. You guys know that we've been growing up into a nice big old meaty tiger on over here in these last 3 years, and we just continue to keep on feeding. Yes, we do it best. So thank you for tuning into today's episode of the show. If you want to head on over to ilovedtp.com to give that little bit of extra support, you know I will love you with all of my heart for doing so. All right, next week on the show, we are joined by Cone of Sum 40 freaking 1. That's right, you guys. Sum 41 is going to be joining the show, and I am so excited. So excited, I don't even know what to say. So I will just see you next week right here on the Desert Tiger Podcast. Yeah!